all ready to join me today in our trip to outer space?
Yeah.
Albert Shivers.
The Matrix doesn't happen.
That's very true.
Come along quietly or not.
Goodbye, Willis.
As I was about to try to bribe
From Albert
the
Shivers.
mistress of the fading light.
They don't have to like it.
They're trying to put a caravan.
The general concept is that creativity flourishes in an atmosphere of freedom.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Planet Shivers Podcast. I am, as I've always been, Albert Shivers, and I'm excited for this episode today. My guest on Planet Shivers this week is Motorsports Documentarian, author, journalist, and NASCAR historian, Brock Beard. He is also one of my favorite NASCAR YouTubers. I think that his analysis of the sport and his historical perspective to it is not only amazing, but also very much needed. One thing about NASCAR and motorsports, but really NASCAR, is the importance of the history behind it. And Brock and I talk about that too. It was a big thrill to be able to talk with him. I've been watching his channel for a long time now, and he's on the podcast. I never would have thought it, but here we are. I just also want to let you know that both Brock and I had a little bit of audio trouble as we set up the Skype for this episode. Just want to make you aware of that. Things are not perfectly ideal, but I tuned them up as good as I possibly can. But it fits the theme. This is my guerrilla B-movie podcast. To put it in NASCAR terms, we're kind of like the Furniture Row Racing of podcasts, if that makes sense to all my NASCAR people out there. But with a little bit of help, we might be able to win a championship out of nowhere. So, with all that said, just want to fill you guys in on a little bit of what's cooking with me. New art show coming up this weekend at the Create and Be Art Gallery. They're doing their annual Black Culture show. My very popular Richard Pryor portrait will be in this show, as well as 3 other pieces, 2 of which that have never been shown anywhere before. And my art show at the Gamut Art Gallery, my pen and ink show, is also still going on. That will be going on until May 14th. You could see what else is cooking on my Instagram at Albert Shivers, as well as www.albertshivers.com. For any of race fans who are tuned into this show for this episode, I do a lot of race-related art too, combining surrealism, pen and ink, throw a little Salvador Dali on NASCAR. With that, I'm going to shut up and we're going to get to my conversation with Brock Beard. I want to thank Brock a whole bunch for coming on the show and us making it work with our schedules. We covered a lot of cool stuff and I really, really hope you enjoy it. It was great to talk to somebody who loves this sport as much as I do, if not more, and to be able to talk with somebody who really speaks fluent NASCAR. It's really NASCAR mother tongue. I knew that whatever I threw at Brock, he'd be able to pick up and run with, and that's pretty cool. You know, we're all from the same NASCAR island, and we all speak the same language, but not many people speak it, and it's always fun to find a native speaker. And finally, the secret word for this episode is Dodge, as in the car or the truck. If you find Brock and I saying the word Dodge, timestamp it in the comments below. The first correct timestamp gets a shout out on the next episode of Planet Shivers. I will talk to you on the other side of this conversation. Enjoy my talk with Brock after these messages.
This Saturday night, June 3rd, one night only at Raceway Park, the Snap-on Tools Night of Thrills. Presented by PC Richard & Son. Ashley Force, daughter of 13-time 20-car NHRA champ John Force. Racing Hooray Fuel Dragster. Plus 300-mile-an-hour nitro funny cars. The blown alcohols, pro stock motorcycles, wild wheel standards, jet cars, and more. A record-setting car jump. Plus 6 car-crushing monster trucks. Everyone gets in. Tickets at the gate. Gates at 5. Show at 7 p.m. The Snap-on Tools Night of Thrills. Presented by PC Richard & Son.
Brock Beard. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Brock.
Hey, thank you for having me.
The first thing I think I'd like to know, and it's something I like to know from every NASCAR fan that I run across, is how did you get into the sport?
Oh, good question. For me, I know people have different stories about like different racetracks they grew up with or different drivers they followed. I think for me, first and foremost, it was Days of Thunder.
Okay.
It came out in 1990. I started following the sport in 91. The movie had a tremendous impression on me. I was about 8 or 9 years old at that time. And ultimately, I live here in Northern California, so it made so much of an impression on me that we ultimately went to our first race next year at Sears Point. First time I traveled out there recently, just celebrating the anniversary of going out there. And just fell in love with the sport. I think it was, to see it in a movie was one thing, and kind of really the exaggerations of the way the races play out. And then to see it in person. The first race I saw was Ernie Irvan going from worst to first after a black flag on the first lap and coming back to win. Of course, this was Richard Petty's fan appreciation tour. Mm-hmm. And Petty featured kind of prominently here and there in Days of Thunder. So it was just kind of the realization of that. And I think it really was. I mean, it was a tremendous experience. Family had a great time on that, just made me that much more curious about the sport and watching the telecasts from there. And it really kind of picked up momentum from that point.
Gotcha. So being there in 1992 during Petty's last season, how heavy was that, I guess, in terms of how much presence was there to know that this was Petty's last season?
Well, it was huge. Absolutely huge. I think the first souvenir I picked up at the track was one of the fan appreciation tour die-cast there. They issued them for all the different tracks, and then Sears Point had their own version of it there. I think that was probably one of the first things that really attracted me to actually, seeing it at the track. The first moment I remember seeing an actual race broadcast was Rick Mast flipping upside down at Talladega, which is July of 91. And then Petty made his announcement in October of 91. And I think it just really speaks to the extent of the advertising that the Fan Appreciation Tour had in 92, that somebody like myself, who was very, very new to the sport and also, again, 9 or 10 years old, it was everywhere. It was everywhere. I remember they had like remote control cars of Petty's car. Micro Machines did a promotion where they made versions of his car. The 43 STP car was just seemed to be everywhere, and it's still one of my favorite paint schemes, and it's also a reason I've always been very partial to the old Pontiac teams as well. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I fully appreciated it in terms of his career. Certainly, being aware of the 200 wins and him as the brand. I always remember him from more. He did the commercials for Armor All Protected and stuff like that, and he was still such a visible figure even in that phase of his career that that was probably the first storyline of really following from one week to the next.
Gotcha. So one of the things that you put out is your Jerry Nadeau special. About you being in the fan club, all the different things that they would do for the fans through that fan club. And I'm sure that Jerry was not the only driver to have such a fan club. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is how, at least in my time of being a fan, NASCAR seems so connected to the fan base, even more so than other sports probably. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit on that, on how it does feel, even as a fan, it does feel like one big family.
I think that's fair to say. I think the other thing is it's one big family, but it's also, I think it's the same thing. Like any family, there's also a very deep lore. There's also it's all one story, and I think that was probably the thing that really grabbed me. I mean, even at a time when you didn't have social media, and of course it's so hard to imagine that now, like you mentioned. I mean, people are so plugged into drivers these days.
Yeah.
Even just watching it from, even when you're just experience of it is just one race to the next, and trying to kind of string. I think it was so much more important back then to like build those storylines and understand how one race built on the next, and how this driver is trending this way, this driver is trending that way. And the fan clubs were a big part of that too. I actually wrote a letter. I didn't mention this in the native video. I wrote a letter to NASCAR asking about what fan clubs are out there, because I don't think I was even aware of what website had the information or anything. Okay. And I actually got a letter. I have it somewhere on NASCAR letterhead that literally had the addresses to all the fan clubs from 1999.
That's cool.
And so that was, and again, it's a perfect transitional period, because right around then you started to have people have their own websites and stuff like that too. But a lot of it was still pen and paper and typed out. And that was how I signed up for Jerry Nadive's fan club. And I was also, Ricky Rudd was another driver I pulled for. I kind of mentioned him a little bit in the Nadive video. And those are the two fan clubs I signed up for. And I always loved, the little stuff they would send in the mail, newsletters, stickers, things like that. And that's something I tried to actually kind of maintain myself in my Patreon, if you forgive the plug. Sure. Patreon.com/LASTCAR.info. I still send out periodic newsletters on kind of updates on what I'm doing, and I have like stickers I print each year for returning members and stuff. And a lot of that is very much inspired by those clubs back then.
Gotcha. Yeah, like as I came into the sport about 2003. Friend of the family worked for Interstate Batteries, and I was flooded with Bobby Labonte gear.
Ah, okay.
So that was my first driver, and it was a tough road jumping in on Bobby Labonte being a fan in 2003. I got to see a couple of wins, and then it sort of petered off. But one thing that stood out to me was how we really were taught a lot about the drivers. They were in commercials. They were on cereal boxes. You really got the chance to almost feel like you knew them in a way. There was always something about their personal life, whether in the pre-race or during the week. So you, at least to my point of view, you were able to, again, feel close to them, that you knew these little things about them. And generally, Junior, you had Dale Sr. and Ralph, or you knew the families as well, and the fact that things were very much passed down through drivers and even crews and crew chiefs. You always heard about the families, and that to me made it feel like that big family atmosphere.
No, I agree. I think that's very much, and I think, you're really making me kind of think about how that's kind of evolved, because it used to be, you talk to like fans, even older than myself, where they talk about the culture at the garage area, and people just able to just kind of walk in and out of the garage area and see, J.D. McDuffie working on his car, or, Dave Marcus, and then they'd be right mixed in with big names like, Dale Earnhardt or, Jeff Gordon would be kind of be walking around through there too. And then nowadays, it's the social media angle. Now we're probably learning even more about these drivers' lives than anybody could have had in a multitude of conversations in that time period. And, I guess it's not really good or bad. It's just different, I think, for sure. I do think there's kind of a longing for that time period as being perceived as a bit more simple. But I think part of that simplicity was just the that there was still a little bit of a barrier, because it was some kind of a regional sport at that time. So I think you had to be more aggressive in trying to find out, more information about drivers. And yes, they would be in a lot of places, like you said, with advertising and everything too. And that was certainly the case, but it was kind of up to you to kind of piece all that together and kind of develop your own perception of like these drivers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do understand what you mean. I do. So another interesting aspect about the sport are the independent teams. And you have spent a lot of time working and highlighting the independent teams with your Rise of the Field Fillers series. And looking back through the history, I definitely didn't notice it when I first got into the sport. When you're uneducated about it, you just kind of say, okay, those are the guys in the back. And when they do run up front, it's usually through some kind of strategy or could possibly be looked at as quote-unquote as a fluke. But the more I've dove into the history and learned about the sport, those independent teams and those quote-unquote back markers are very important to the sport as a whole, all through from the beginning to now even. So if you could talk a little bit about Rise of the Field Fillers and your interest in showcasing those teams and those drivers.
Oh, certainly. You know, I've always, I don't know where exactly this started with me, but I've always been kind of adverse to hype. I always kind of, whenever there's a story that's getting plenty of coverage, you know, I guess it's kind of strange. Especially after leading off with the Fan Appreciation Tour and how big of a story that was. Usually when it is a big story about like a top driver or something like that, I never grew up as really, a Dale Earnhardt fan or a Jeff Gordon fan or somebody that was really big into following just the winners and kind of forget everybody else. I was always curious about just aspects of the sport that we didn't see. And again, kind of that striving to find more information, kind of like I was describing earlier. That was probably the start of it. Something I always mention on when I'm asked a question like this is the late great Bob Jenkins. I think was easily one of the most. I think hero is a little bit of a difficult term there, but definitely influential personalities in my own life. And I think one thing that I love that he did was he really. And the rest of the ESPN crew, really. But, him as kind of the leader of that, really gave you a full experience of the race. If you couldn't beat the track, you had something you could say about really most of the field, if not everybody. And even if it was just a passing moment, like, one thing he would do is when the leaderboard would come up, and if you watch those old races, the leaderboard wasn't constantly on the side of the screen. Right. It would pop up maybe every 10, 15 laps. He would always start off by saying, here's the leaderboard, a Fram Field summary. Look where your favorite driver is running. And I always stuck with that literally. I always thought, okay, well, that's not just Dale Earnhardt or Jeff Bodine or Rusty Wallace. That's probably even like, I always love the thought of somebody being a fan of the drivers that are further back in the lineup. Somebody that's already a lap down or fell out of the race, and then wanting to tune in and see how that driver is doing. And not all. Often we didn't see the paint schemes of a lot of these cars, or very rarely, or you didn't see what happened to them. They wouldn't have they'd have good garage reporters, but we wouldn't see the moment they went to the garage area. I was always curious about that aspect of it, and I think that's perfectly captured in these field fillers. And we've seen, and as I described in episode 1, the sport's always gone through these cycles where it's had really lean times and really profitable times, I think, and it's always gone back and forth. And when it's been lean, you've had these kind of smaller teams that have had to kind of really step up and, even if they only had part-time or maybe one-off money, really try to stretch that out to being almost a full-time effort until things got good again. Right. And 2004 was a case of this. 2009 was another one. And 1992, even with the Fan Appreciation Tour, there were a lot of field fillers that season. But again, some of that information, it may be lost to history, but a lot of those people are still out there and still available, to talk to. And I've been very pleased, in all but really one case so far, that people have been really eager to kind of, two cases really, that people have been eager to kind of share their memories, from when they were either a team owner that operated one of these teams or a driver that drove for one of these teams. I've had some drivers where they said, well, look, that just wasn't really a fun time in my career. But I've had other ones where, like Andy Belmont, I was on the phone with him for like 3 hours, and he just had all these great stories. And it really led to, I think that's probably one of my favorite episodes of that series, and it's entirely because of him. I just had to just boil it down into something that was 40 minutes long or whatever, because, he's the star of it. That's the thing, is like every field has those guys. And even if they're not necessarily a field filler, not necessarily a small team, obviously today in the Cup Series, the charter system, right, what qualifies as a small team is not that far off of, the main beat with the new car. But, there's still some consistency at the bottom of the field. Your live fast effort, your Rick Ware effort, and so forth. Yeah, I mean that's kind of been my interest there. I think it's always. I was thinking about this before the show here tonight, and I was thinking, really, it's not always what I put forward in my videos isn't always just something I just know offhand. A lot of times, it's the result of me trying to really understand something I have an interest in, and then I'm learning something, and I like to share it with people. So that's kind of the thing. There's some stuff I do know. I don't like to trust my memory 100% because I don't like getting something completely wrong and then posting it online. But that's what I really enjoy. I feel like, hey, here's this thing I found. Look, isn't this weird? And then that's kind of the way I approach the videos.
Gotcha. To jump back to Bob Jenkins for a second, I watched a lot of those races on ESPN Classic once I got into the sport. And one thing that always stood out to me was that when Bob Jenkins and even Ned Jarrett and Benny would jump in on it, but their through the fields were more detailed than later years, where they would almost, if they didn't all the time, go completely through from first to 43rd, or at the time it was LASTCAR's 40. And that always stood out to me too, where they would dedicate a period of time to each driver in the field and did make it feel like, it's to me it was easy to only think of the top 10 or the top 15 drivers and kind of hone in on them. But like you say, there are a bunch of drivers out there, all with their own stories, and they're all working just as hard to get around the track, some harder than others. So I noticed that and appreciated it when I first seen it on the older broadcasts.
I agree. I think that was a huge aspect of that. Is again, it's a full field experience. Any driver in that field, could be a very big story. I think even one of the full through the fields that I recall specifically. I mean, this is more in hindsight. I didn't see it live, but in '89 at the Atlanta race, that was the championship race. They caught up with Derrike Cope at one point and mentioned that he had a few strong runs. Like, wow, he's looking really good. We're going to have to keep an eye on this guy. And then, lo and behold, a few months later, he goes to Chevy and he wins the Daytona 500. And it's like, and everybody's like, where did he come from? It's like, these people don't come from nowhere. Even a guy like Jamie McMurray or Trevor Bayne that won very early in their careers, they worked like hell to get up to that point. And they earned their spot. I mean, you got pay drivers, you got people that are working up there. But, in one way or the other, they worked their way up to that spot. And that's a story worth telling. And that's one thing I like with the last place, the articles, too, is I think that allows, pretty much, maybe only a few drivers can win, even in modern NASCAR. But anybody can finish in last place. And with that is also an opportunity to kind of, slow things down a little bit. It's like, yeah, the last place finish is a framework, but also kind of talk about, who this driver is, how they've been performing, how the team's been performing, what they're looking forward to, and kind of catch up in that moment in time. So I think I know you didn't ask me about LASTCAR, but that's kind of the connection there too.
Yeah, and it's you mentioned Trevor Bayne's Daytona 500. I remember watching that race live, and I didn't fully even appreciate that finish until I had started to learn more about the history and like Wood Brothers and all that kind of thing. And they did when they were doing the documentaries The Day, I don't remember if it was Speed Channel, but they had done the documentary on that finish. And to me, I was very into the sport, but I wasn't very deep into it. And you don't always see, to what you were saying, you don't always see the journey to that. My introduction to Trevor Bayne was I think it was 2011, or I'm sorry, 2011 was that Daytona? So my introduction to Trevor Bayne was Speed Weeks leading up to that race.
And you're not alone on that. I mean, there were a lot of people that were, for sure. That didn't watch him as much in the Busch Series or, kind of working his way, up the ladder that way. But, but yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of somebody that would be a contender, I mean, that whole week, I mean, Jeff Gordon said he wanted to draft with him.
Yep.
It's like, who is this kid? But yeah, I mean, the history of the Wood brothers is tremendous in the sport there. And I remember doing a montage. I kind of did starting grids and kind of hype videos around that time period. And I was putting one together for that year's 500, and I felt like I was putting too much Wood Brothers clips in it.
Okay.
And so I remember having that thought, and it's like, oh, it's kind of a little, but I kind of left it more or less the same, never thinking that Bain was even going to be a factor in this. I don't think I even knew for sure he was going to be driving the car for that race.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly, yeah, just like Tiny London, 63, he goes out there and he's the big hero. So.
Yeah. So you mentioned Derrike Cope. One of the other big aspects of what you do is being an author, and you've written a book about J.D. McDuffie, probably one of the, to my opinion, the face of the independent driver of NASCAR since I started to learn about him. And you're working on a Derrike Cope book. If you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about the J.D. McDuffie book and also a little bit about the upcoming Cope book.
Certainly. J.D. McDuffie is a figure that not intentionally, but constantly has come up in just about any kind of research I've done on the sport. And really, unofficially, my research for the J.D. McDuffie book really began about 1999-2000, about the same time, like I was talking about the fan club letter. Around that same time, although I got into the sport in July of 91 with Rick Massflip, I didn't see JD's last race at Watkins Glen, so I had no memory of that. I had no awareness of who he was, and I certainly wasn't aware that he was killed in that race at Watkins Glen. All of that came up more in, again, kind of the start of the internet era. Around 99, 2000, I found a diecast at an antique dealer in the Bay Area. And it was a really interesting, distinct looking car. It's that burgundy and black car, kind of like you see on the cover of the book there. Okay. And I never heard of this guy, and I was like, this is kind of interesting. And then I did a Google search, or whatever the equivalent was back then, and it brought up this stuff from Watkins Glen. It's like, wait a minute, this driver was killed in Watkins Glen, and and then curiosity really began at that point, trying to understand what exactly happened in the accident, and then trying to also, of course, understand who he was himself. Mm-hmm. I kind of pieced some stuff together. I found some books that had some pictures in them. There was a guy, I think when Steve Park won Watkins Glen in 2000, he posted some of the pictures he had himself of Watkins Glen in 91 and talking about the accident. And it really was just, again, kind of like I mentioned with the videos. It was just my own curiosity. It's like, okay, well, let me see if I can understand this. By 2016, I kind of had the thought in the back of my mind about doing something with JD. But what really kicked things into overdrive really with that was in 2011, on just a leap of faith. Mm-hmm. I reached out to Marty Burke, who came up in an article. One of the articles I found about JD said something about him having JD's car from his last race at Watkins Glen. Wasn't sure what the details were. I heard there was something with the family. So I kind of looked up his name, and I found his email address through a website. And I just sent an email out and says, hey, I'm kind of interested about JD. Can you kind of tell me about it? He says, yeah, I worked on his crew in the mid-'80s. First message he got back to me, I was like, oh my God, this is a guy that, this is the first person I've reached out to that actually had firsthand knowledge, not just knowledge of JD, but somebody that had worked with him directly. Mm-hmm. And that became kind of an article I did in 2011 around the anniversary of the accident. I guess that would have been the 20th anniversary of the accident back then. We developed a good friendship. He's still, we still talk, here and there about JD. And at that point, he knew a couple other crew members, and those crew members knew a couple other people, and then eventually cycled back around to the family, who were very hard to reach initially. But then Linda McDuffie, JD's daughter, was extremely helpful with that, got me in touch with her mother, Imogene, who just passed just recently. I'm so glad I was able to get a hold of her before that. And every single person I talked to, even Jimmy Means, who famously peeked his head in the window of JD's car after that accident, right away was just an open book. And the first thing he told me is what he saw. And everybody was just that. It's like everybody had these stories and was just waiting for somebody to come around to ask them. I think maybe in some cases, maybe they had shared these stories. I certainly sensed with Linda that there had been something like that. But with everybody else, I think it was like maybe either they were overlooked or they just kind of kept it to themselves. And they shared so much information with me. And at that point, I was thinking about doing a video, but then I was like, no, this has got to be a book, especially with some of the pictures that Mike Demers, who also sadly is no longer with us, Charlie Birch, who's very much with us over in New York State, and others kind of sharing their materials from it. I was like, oh my gosh, I think this is going to be a really, really good book when it gets done. And I've been very pleased with the response. It's released now in its second edition. Last year I had a couple of updates provided from some other people that I've spoken to since the book came out. So I feel very good about, there's probably going to be a third edition further on because I never want to be done with J.D. McDuffie. I don't think it's possible to be because I think, and I haven't mentioned much about himself, J.D. himself. I mean, I think that was kind of the mystery to piece together is because, you don't have the person himself to talk to, and everybody that says something about J.D. Was just saying how shy and how quiet he was, so he kept to himself. So you really had to kind of piece all this together, and I hope it would be something that he would have approved of. I know that, I've been pleased with a lot of people that have been involved in it that they've reacted positively to it. And that was really kind of the goal. I was very pleased. Waldorf Publishing, took a chance on me on that. That was the first publisher I'd worked with. We're not working together at this moment but I mean, I still owe them, a lot of gratitude for giving me the chance to get my first book out there because, I mean, that's what you really got to do to kind of get out there in this business. The Derrike Cope book is actually going to be self-published in the process of that. And that one, what I really wanted to do with the next book, Field Fillers was actually going to be my next book. But that's why all the material, especially the first few episodes, kind of came together relatively quickly, not 100% real fast, but a lot of that was going to be in a book. But I felt like I was just transcribing video clips I was seeing, and I was like, well, this would probably be better just as a video, and then I'm not wasting all this time transcribing what you could just see. You could see Derrike Cope's qualifying lap for Arnold Motorsports or Andy Hillenberg's interview on race day or anything. Those are things that I think are much more effective in a video format. But that was going to be my next one. When that kind of took off more during COVID, by that point I already started doing the research for the Derrike Cope book. And Derrike was probably one of the first drivers I pulled for. At Sears Point in '92, he was the first autograph I got. So he actually signed my Mickey Mouse hat. He just got back from Disneyland earlier that year, and I still have the hat somewhere. So I just loved. I mean, again, I loved the paint schemes he ran. I thought he was a very interesting personality. Certainly, the win the Daytona 500 was a big part of that too. But again, a driver I felt like even back then that really wasn't getting the full credit for his accomplishments, and I think that's something I want to kind of focus on in his book. So I'm sorry, this is kind of a long answer.
That's okay.
But with Derrike, I mean, I think it was important that the next book not be on another tragedy. I didn't want it to be another story about a driver that lost his life. I wanted it to be something to show. I want the kind of connection to be, again, look what I found. It's more like these are stories that even longtime fans of the sport think they understand, myself included. I mean, I thought I fully understood exactly what happened with Derrike Cope. Not at all. Not until speaking with him directly and his wife Alicia and other of his sponsor representatives completely changed my perception of him and his career. And I hope that that's going to come across in the book itself. Because I do think that you talk about Trevor Bayne. You talk about the concept of maybe a fluke winning the 500, even though Derrike ultimately won another Cup race that year at Dover. Right. Trying to kind of understand more why things happened in his career, what steps he took, and is continuing to take. He's still active. He and his wife are active in Trans Am right now. Okay. So it's and that's the other thing. The other challenge of the book. The ending had to keep getting rewritten when everything was happening. When they were operating, when they started Starcom, when they closed Starcom, when they got into Trans Am, and all this other stuff. So the ending's been rewritten a few times, but I think I'm at the point now where I'm like, okay, I think this will be a good stopping point. It's going to tie everything together, and we'll cover all that. So, but I think the connecting trait is JD's accident and Derrike Cope's winning in the Daytona 500 are big moments in the early 90s of the sport, which was, again, a formative time for me. Mm-hmm. But I think deserve a real deep dive into understanding everything that led up to it and stuff that has happened afterwards. And that is very much going to be the same approach to the Derrike Cope book there. But again, under tone-wise, very different context, where we're talking about not just a driver that won, but a driver that won the hardest race that is to win in the NASCAR even today, the Daytona 500. So, and I hope that that's going to come across there in the book, because in future books, and I'm kicking around ideas about other things further down the line. I'm kind of spending more time on. I plan on spending more time on the videos after this book's released, but that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it. I obviously came in after his Daytona 500 win. To me, he was always somebody who ran more in the back of the pack. As I got deeper into the sport, realized that these people had big careers and climbed tall mountains to get to where they are. So I look forward to reading the book once it's out. I'm excited for it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll jump to 500 days now. I think that depending on how deep one wants to get into NASCAR or any form of motorsports, the details that one can dive into are almost limitless, at least to my view. And I never even realized just how much went on from the end of 2000 to the end of that Daytona 500. With Dodge coming in, and even all the, I never really pieced together how standout even the events leading up to the 500 were. The IROC race, the truck race with Bodine's accident, just a couple of days before. So there were so many storylines in that documentary that you made, and the biggest of which being Dale Sr. So what made you decide to dedicate the amount of time that it took to do this several-part documentary? What was your inspiration behind it?
Certainly. It was a couple different reasons. In the short term, as Field Fillers was continuing, the episodes were taking longer and longer to produce, but not, it wasn't really from my side of it, because I was still able to get a good amount of research on these different drivers. Brian Hallman of the BRH Racing Archives, I got to give a shout out to him, because he has provided tremendous pictures and continues to for these different drivers that are featured in the series. So there was no issue with that, and no issue finding video and stuff to kind of put in there. It was just hard to get that last step of getting the interview with the driver to kind of tie it all together. I released the Hermie Sadler video without his interview. I really hated to do that, because I felt, especially now, he's like running for public office now. So I'm like, It's like, but I just sense that he's just a tremendously busy individual with all the businesses he's involved in and charitable initiatives that he's involved with. I think it just would have been difficult to pin him down for even 20 minutes there on that. So I just went forward with that episode. Was about to do the same thing with Stanton Barrett, which is the next episode I had planned on that. Stanton had concerns with the script when I first sent it. I was like, okay, cool, we'll workshop it. We'll do another interview. I think he's even busier than Hermie, with, of course, now his work in Hollywood and He's a cook. He's got, I mean, my gosh, he's just a absolute furnace of activity. So what I decided to do is basically, even back when 500 Days was starting to kind of come together, I decided to just kind of just put that on the back burner. You know, hopefully, maybe, you know, if it was tomorrow we do an interview, or if it's 3 years from now, it'll be ready to be finished off at that point. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to hold up anything on this. So my plan was with the 500 Days to just kind of produce something while I was waiting out kind of Stanton's schedule on his thing. And my thinking was initially I was just going to do silly season in the 2000 season and kind of lead up to 2001. But there was so much momentum when I started writing that. It carried it right up into Speed Weeks 2001. And then it's like that went right into the 500. And then really you can't talk about the 500 and not talk about, of course, what happened with, you know, with Dale Earnhardt. And that carries you right into Rockingham. Mm-hmm. So even when I announced it as a 3-part series in November, I'd already been working on the 4th part since September. So, and I thought about changing the trailer, but I'm like, well, there's probably going to be people who aren't going to want to see part 4. Because, I mean, people that were long-time Earnhardt fans. So I didn't want to feel like it was something that they would be obliged to have to see. Right. Which is why I even went to the point of even making a disclaimer beforehand. But, I mean, they've done very well. I've been very pleased with the response on all of them there. Yeah, I got to say, probably the 2000 season in particular has come up in so many of my videos, and I think really it's just what I think that was a really key moment in my own following of the sport. I really didn't follow as much as I got into the sport in the early 90s. I usually just kind of watched races here and there in terms of like watching races on a consecutive week basis and really kind of following those storylines. That was more like 99 into 2000. Okay. So at the peak of that was certainly everything leading into 2001. I distinctly remember, and I was a senior in high school at this point, you know, everything felt like it was building to something. Like Dale Earnhardt won that Talladega race. They had that aero package. It was incredible. I mean, even back then, compared to the races back then and with the drivers we had back then, that was an exceptional race. And everybody wouldn't stop talking about it. It's like, okay, now they're going to run this same package at Daytona for an even bigger prize as being the 500 winner. Then you have on top of this, you got Fox coming in for the first time, and they have this whole new view of covering the sport. You got Dodge coming in there. We hadn't had a new manufacturer. My whole time following the sport, I just seen manufacturers leave, like Buick and Oldsmobile. So anybody coming in was just like, it's like that just doesn't happen anymore. But then all of a sudden, there it is. And they got the Petties, and they got these teams. And how good are they going to do? It was such an exciting week, and yeah, it felt like something big. I mean, this 500 is going to be just huge, and it was, and you sense that, and it's so hard to describe that now because, of course, the overwhelming tragedy of losing Dale Earnhardt on the last lap in the last corner of the 2001 Daytona 500 has completely wiped all that away, I think, from almost everybody's memory. I think nobody looks at that race without thinking about what happened to it. And I don't mean to minimize that at all. I mean, which is why I wanted to continue it on and keep talking about what happened afterwards. I think it's so important to really break down that Speed Weeks 2001 was every bit of even more exciting than you could even possibly imagine. Even more than like when Toyota came in like 2007. Like, I mean, that was pretty big, but the Dodge thing was 10 times more easily in terms of like how much hype and what companies were behind putting things out there. You had companies like General Mills and the diecast cars and all that and thing. You got new companies like UPS that were sponsoring not Dodge teams, but sponsoring Dale Jarrett and new companies coming in, and everybody wants their piece of the pie. And then the Super Speedway package and Fox and Dodge, it was huge. And that whole week, that excitement was palpable. It was just. It's so hard to describe. You really have to just kind of. I mean, what I wanted to kind of capture in making this, especially part 2, which I've seen is consistently been the most popular of the 4 episodes so far. I think everybody really responded to that. They really responded to this was really. I mean, well, the way you described it too. It was really this exciting with this much stuff happening, and at the center of it, in all those events leading up to the 500 was always Dale Earnhardt. He only ran 4 of those races that week. But each time he ran, and this is why I broke things down, to start part 4 of the series. I really want to kind of really draw that out and mention, look, this was not a man at the end of his career. Mm-hmm. This was a man who was revitalized. This was a man who was driving his best that he ever had, never knowing what was going to happen. Obviously, that he could have won the shootout. He was leading, coming to the white flag. He could have won his duel. He was leading on the backstretch on the last lap. Mm-hmm. He could have won the IROC race. Eddie Cheever had to literally drive him into the grass, and even then he didn't wreck the car.
Right.
And he could have won the 500 even after running in the back of Ken Schrader. I think as Dr. Jerry Punch mentioned so solemnly that night after we got the news, he could have made a move, and he could have made a move that entire week. And I think that really speaks to how competitive things were, but also how competitive he was. So I'm glad that came to the surface in the video there to kind of show that, look, this wasn't a guy that was over the hill. This wasn't a guy that, this happened. I mean, he was running third when the accident happened. Yeah. The man was at his absolute best. And I think now that so much time has gone by, it's amazing to think, really, even after we've seen like Blink of an Eye that Michael Waltrip did. I still think it's a fantastic documentary. Mm-hmm. And The Day, you mentioned that series. Yeah. The one that FS1 did on that was great too, which is why that one part of it where between the accident and the end of the Fox broadcast, I really don't focus on in my series because I can't improve on what they did. I mean, I'd just be repeating their stuff, and I wasn't really interested in that. No. But everything that led up to that moment and everything that happened immediately after that is the stuff that either people blocked out of their memories or has just been overshadowed. And that's what I really wanted to capture. And really, the series is going to be continuing, too, because that momentum that I described that really started this, it really continues into, Vegas, Atlanta. I mean, you're wearing the Harvick hat right here. I'm sure you're pretty excited to see the 29 back on the track at Wilkesboro.
Yeah.
It occurred to me, for somebody like me, I mean, I remember when he ran the white car at Sears Point in the 29 car in 2001 and cost Robbie Gordon that win that year. I mean, I go far enough back, but I mean, there's fans that have been in the sport now. I mean, it's been 10 years since he's run the 29 in 2013. Yeah. People haven't even seen that number on the track. So I know that's going to mean a ton to people out there. And I'm hoping to get some more episodes of this out before that race. That's at least a goal I'm working on here. We'll see how that works out. But certainly Harvick comes up a lot in the Rockingham episode. So I definitely was glad. I had no idea. Well, again, this just fell into place. But, I mean, when I released that episode, it was the night before he announced his retirement. I mean, the rumors were already out when that was premiering, but it wasn't confirmed until the next day. No idea on that. I mean, things just fall into place. But I think that's definitely no reason people responded so positively to that one, despite the fact that phase of it, of course, is such a difficult aspect. But and I think you can tell from just me describing this. I mean, it was all these emotions in just a few days. I mean, it's called 500 days, but that's just all the lead up from late 1999 through 2000. It's really compressed down to just like those 9 or 10 days. The last part of that there, leading up to February 18th, 2001. It was just everything. I mean, I remember my brother and I watching that race. I have a younger brother, 4 years younger than me, so he remembers that clearly. He's a big Sterling Marlin fan. I've asked him if that race ever gave him kind of mixed feelings about that because he was kind of a Marlin and an Earnhardt fan, and he kind of downplayed it. But I'm sure it was something that that bothered him at the time. But yeah, I remember we were watching the end of that Fox broadcast. There's that clip. I don't know if I played it in 500 Days where Mike Joyce says Dale Jr. dreams of winning the Daytona 500. Michael Waltrip just dreams of winning this race, any race. Like just really hammering. Like the whole week, Fox is just hammering that stat, and Michael's like, okay, come on, everybody's still talking about this. Right. And of course, that at least for a moment he got to enjoy that, but not nearly long enough. But I mean, that was that was huge. I mean, my God, Michael Waltrip's winless streak was something we had followed for so long, even just in the few years that I'd watched it. I remember that Martinsville race that he finished third in the year before. It's like, man, he's getting there. He just can't quite get there. And when he got the ride with DEI, it's like, well, I mean, heck, I mean, it could be. This could be the chance, but I mean, I don't think realistically we were watching him that much of the race until he was up there. It's like, man, he's really got a piece. And then but I mean, that was just so much. It's such a dense subject, and it's not a Dale Earnhardt video necessarily in that series, but because I love to give as much context as possible, because what I wanted to do, and I hope it's succeeded in this, is to bring fans like yourself or others who either weren't fans back then or weren't even alive back then. I mean, we've had a whole generation back then now that are in their young 20s that don't even know weren't even alive at a time when Earnhardt was around. So I want to really bring him to that time period and be able to live. I mean, it's not it's not a 1-to-1, but as close as possible to what it felt like. And I think those of us who have had more experience following the sport, I think that's what we owe to younger generations, is to really make that feel alive so that they can share in that experience. I mean, I could just as easily, just lock myself in a room, watch old races, not share it with anybody. But I don't think that's going to be. I don't think that's the proper use of time. I think the best way to do that is to really share that with people and really bring them into it. And again, I'm not always successful in doing that, but I hope that in some cases I have.
On the topic of one more question about 500 days that I have in regards to Dale Earnhardt. So, like I had mentioned before, I came into the sport in 2003, just a couple of years after his passing, and coming into the sport at that time, obviously I knew immediately who Dale Earnhardt was and Dale Jr. But at that time, looking back on it, Earnhardt was perceived as almost not human. He was on such a pedestal, and understandably, his accomplishments and he had passed so recently. So one thing that I'd like to ask you, as somebody who was around while he was driving, just to think of how to word it, is not so much like, was the hype true? I'm pretty sure that it was, but what was that feel? Was he always the headline? Was he always a focal point during races that he was in, watching them live?
That's a good question. There's a split, at least in my experience, and again, I think somebody maybe that had more experience watching the sport in the 80s or even late 70s in Earnhardt's earlier career can comment on this even better. But I remember, like, early 90s, first couple of years of the sport, it seemed like there were a lot of people that were Earnhardt fans. I mean, you were either like an Earnhardt fan, you were a Rusty Wallace fan, you were a Kyle Petty fan. One of the guys with the black cars. It always seemed like it was that.
Okay.
So that was kind of the thing back then. But then the late 90s, and I described this in one video I did, when I kind of turned, kind of refocused my channel a little bit, was why late 90s NASCAR was great besides Dale Earnhardt. And that's not, again, much like 500 days, not meant to be a slight against Earnhardt, but to understand, to answer the very question you asked, which is, was Earnhardt this kind of all-encompassing figure? Mm-hmm. The short answer really was no. Because in the late 90s, Jeff Gordon was the guy. It was Gordon versus the field. Anything from 95 to right up to 2001, even including the 500. Gordon is fantastic in that race, too. Mm-hmm. He saved that car from wrecking 2 or 3 times that speed weeks before getting caught up in somebody else's mess in the big wreck. Would have easily been a threat for that win had that not happened. And I think that goes to show it. I was thinking about this earlier today too. I still believe, even having seen the last decade of Earnhardt's career, I think Jeff Gordon is the best race car driver I've ever seen in NASCAR, easily. easily.
Okay.
I think he was exceptional to have matched against guys like Earnhardt and Rusty Wallace and Dale Jarrett and Mark Martin in the late 90s. And then you have towards the end of his career, and he's still winning against guys like Kevin Harvick and Joey Logano and Brad Keselowski and, you know, and then guys that are still good now. Kyle Busch, you know, may not have won a championship after 2001, but was constantly in the mix. You know, if Jimmy Johnson wasn't as successful, you know, or if one thing played out this way or that way, you know, who knows how many championships he would have had. I think he's still the most incredible, and I think that was one. Excuse me. One thing I think that factors into that time period is I still remember it as Jeff Gordon versus the field. If Gordon got in a wreck, it's like, oh boy, now somebody else can win. Okay. But it's like that's what it took, and that's why you have all these people that cheered when he wrecked, because it wasn't so much like they wanted him hurt or they wanted him out. No. It's like they knew that was about what they needed to have happen for any of their guys to win. Because there were a lot of people that weren't Gordon fans. You still had a lot of people that were Earnhardt fans. And to kind of go back to your original question, that's where Earnhardt was. He had this tremendous presence, undeniably, to the thought of the sport without him. Like, even in any role, like if he was like even if him not driving was unthinkable. Like, you couldn't, and probably, you know, to make a comparison with like Darrell Waltrip in the mid-90s, I think people were already thinking, well, okay, this guy's probably going to retire. I've always felt bad for Darrell Waltrip because it always feels like he was kind of bridging two generations, that he was a little bit too old for like the Dale Earnhardt era and a little bit too young for the Richard Petty era. That was kind of before. So I always, the only time I remember Darrell Waltrip was him running badly and needing provisionals every week. But I still remember Earnhardt being good in that time period. But Earnhardt, although he had this presence and he was inseparable from the sport, and you couldn't imagine the sport without him, he was still one of the guys. I think he was a guy that had maybe a disproportionate number of fans. Would I say it would be like 10-1, like it was with Dale Jr. after Earnhardt's passing, or when he went to Hendrick Motorsports? I don't think so. I think maybe it was more like 3 or 4-1, maybe something like that. Because you had a lot of guys that had very dedicated. I mean, Jeff Gordon's first and foremost, if we're talking late 90s. Rusty Wallace fans were huge. Kyle Petty fans were huge. Terry Labonte fans were huge. You mentioned Bobby Labonte earlier with the Interstate. He was huge. Jeff Burton. Gosh, the list just goes on and on. You start thinking of Mark Martin. You think of 2 or 3, and you start thinking of the rest of them. All these people had a massive fan presence, and if Dale Earnhardt wasn't the story, say in 1997, 98, he wasn't the story. They didn't pay him any more attention. They didn't say, "Oh, Dale Earnhardt's not running well. What's up with that?" It's just like it would be Ricky Rudd's day, or it would be Terry Labonte's day, and that person would be the feature of it. So, you know, undeniably, I would say he was still more popular than Jeff Gordon, even in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think, you know, a lot is said about him wrecking Terry Labonte at Bristol and people being angry at him. Heck, I think that kept him in people's minds. I think that actually did more for his fan support. At least it felt like it to me. Because it's like, you know, he rattling his cage and stuff. People love that. A lot of people booed at that, but not as many as you may think. A lot of people love that. But yeah, he was one of the guys, and I feel terrible for Dale Jr. because he didn't get to have that experience really for very long in his Cup career. That he had this tremendous burden that was put on him, and he had to be successful, and there was no way on earth that he was going to be near, you know, as successful. His father was just, you know, the 76 wins, the 7 championships. I mean, in many ways, Junior was a fantastic driver, especially on the super speedways. And won some very hard-fought wins. But, you know, much like with Kyle Petty and Richard Petty, much like with, you know, other drivers that we'd seen, you know, different generations, it just wasn't the same situation. And I always remarked, especially towards the end of Dale Jr.'s career, that the sport was then marketed as Junior and Friends. It was always like, here's Dale Jr., and everyone else. Even if it was like a Jeff Gordon, or a Joey Logano or a Brad Keselowski. And there was actually a pretty good discussion earlier today about this, about 2018, and when Junior retired from competition, you had Danica Patrick kind of scaling back her career, and who was going to be the new media darling? There really wasn't. And, I think that was the big difference. So I think, again, going back, not to stray too far for your question there, I think that was the big difference, is that, Earnhardt, he may have been like, the Frank Sinatra of the group, the leader of the Rat Pack, but there was you still had a Sammy Davis Jr., you still had a Dean Martin, you had this other group that was just as noticeable in their own right, even though they were also known as being, Earnhardt was still kind of like the big figure in the garage. They had kind of the mystique about him. And that was one of the things, I think the sport, and again, that turns into a bit of commentary, I think the sport can get back to that. I think it just requires, it's tricky with social media because we feel like we know so much about these drivers already. But in terms of like understanding their role or that personality that comes out, that's so important, because then you can get really strong fan bases for it. I'm sure that there are people that would be huge fans of drivers. I mean, Denny Hamlin, I think, is single-handedly changed. People have already kind of changed their perception somewhat, maybe not 100%. I mean, it's not like he's the most beloved driver. He's going to win most popular driver, but I think he's kind of changed his image into something more accessible to people through his podcast. I think it's mandatory watching and listening to his show, because I think people maybe either didn't understand him or thought that they knew what he was like or whatever. I think he's I love his self-deprecation. I love his knowledge of the sport, his passion, his work ethic, and he's not going to BS around on topics. And if we saw that from other drivers, I don't know if the answer is just every driver needs to have a podcast. Right. I don't know if that would work, but I think that's done wonders. I think that's the closest we've seen to a driver kind of getting closer to that 1990s model. It's like, oh, I know Mark Martin is the guy that's, the really jacked up guy that's working out all the time, and he's dominating, Michigan. Or I know that Rusty Wallace is the really cool guy with the sunglasses that flies airplanes. We need to get closer to that, because I think that we don't need the drivers, the lineup to change completely. We just need to know them better. Right. And I like that there are drivers that, like Hamlin, are kind of doing this, where they're kind of allowing themselves to be seen a lot more, which is good. And I hate it for the ones that came and went in that time period that we never really did get to understand. Who knows? I was thinking of Cole Wint earlier today. I was at one of his last starts at Sears Point, and he was telling me about his sponsorship with Arctic Coolers, still in the sport, and he was running an old Michael Waltrip car and stuff like that, and just kind of understanding these drivers and what they do. You never know who's going to be a big figure, but I think that's what the sport kind of needs to get back to, and that's what Dale Earnhardt was a part of, right? For sure.
Yeah, and speaking to your point, not that every driver needs a podcast, but it was Glass Case of Emotion that got me to become a bit of a Blaney fan.
There you go.
So that's a perfect example, and up until Actions Detrimental, I was a bit indifferent on Hamlin. I didn't dislike him, but never really pulled for him. And I love the insight. I love to hear what's going through his mind in the car. That gives me an idea of what might be going through other drivers' minds in the car. It indirectly gives me insight on the drivers that I am pulling for each week. So, yeah, I became more of a Hamlin fan listening to all that and just kind of hearing it from that perspective, and the opinions of somebody who is in the car and in the sport and isn't afraid to share them.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that's something. I think that the fans. It always makes it sound like the fans are always really upset about everything and that they don't know what they want. I think they know what they want. I think it's just very hard to articulate it sometimes. And I think a lot of disagreements come about for how to reach that goal or what to call that goal or something. But I always look at the sport. I think it's got tremendous potential. I know that the economy is to say the least really rough right now, but I think the direction of the sport, if it's allowed to kind of go the direction it's that it's naturally been going, rather than forcing it to go this direction or forcing it to go that direction, the way it's naturally gone, and bringing in new investors, loving to see Trackhouse and 2311, and even the Live Fast team, even BJ McLeod getting his effort up there. I think that those are positive indicators. I just think the business model isn't 100% perfect, and NASCAR is dealing with that ramifications of that right now too. But it's a reason that I'm very passionate about the way the sport's broadcast, because I think that's the PR image of the sport. It's like especially it's absurd to think that it doesn't have a big role on how the sport's perceived, because it's basically a 3-hour commercial for the sport. So if you're not doing it very well, or you're not showing all these drivers, you're not letting their personalities out, something's wrong, because otherwise it just becomes traffic, and it's way more than that. It still is. So but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, and to just touch on that, one thing that really put that in perspective for me is when you've done your humorous broadcast parodies. I've enjoyed those.
Thank you.
But just comparing even just the cinematography from earlier seasons to now, and I didn't even realize how much it had changed until seeing them both side by side, and just how much that just the cinematography can tell such a story or not tell a story based on what's going on in the race.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you really are putting together a movie live, which I get, and I know that these networks will be like, well, you can't expect us to get it right. We're doing it live. It's like, well, it's not like all these older broadcasts at ESPN or TNN or CBS weren't doing it live. They made it work. So I think it comes down to keeping it simple. Just keep it simple. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't have to be rocket science. We don't need a gopher cam. We don't need 16 different. We don't need a gyro cam or a helmet cam or any of this other stuff. We don't need 30 reporters in the infield. We don't need a studio in Charlotte with a changing graphic behind you and stuff. Like, we could do the first starting grids I did on YouTube in 2008. I did it on a 2001 compact Presario that overheated, that had a big fan underneath it, so you could hear the fan in the background of the audio. Like, and I'm just some schmuck here sitting, sitting in my parents' house there, putting these together. So if I could do that, these networks can clearly, cut a lot of money and just put it in the right places. It just trim things down a little bit and just make it simple. Like, just do a couple camera changes, a couple screen wipes. I was watching the Phoenix race in 2000 recently, because it occurred to me that I hadn't seen the whole race live, and I was on the edge of my seat. Even though I knew who won the race, even though I kind of knew what was coming in there, the way it was shot, it made the track look like it was too small for the cars. It made the cars look like they were going way too fast for the track, or like they were just out of control. But they weren't. It wasn't wreck. It wasn't like they were constantly wrecking. It wasn't even like they're constantly bouncing off the wall. It was just racing shown to be really exciting. And this isn't at Daytona or Talladega. This is at Phoenix.
Right.
And it looked like I was watching, like the way they described Bristol, jet fighters flying around in an auditorium. That's the way it looked, because it was shot so well. And I'm like, oh man, it's like, this is really good. Right. I couldn't turn it off. Like, how many broadcasts recently make you feel that way? See, that's the tricky part. Yeah. We need to get to a point, especially in the YouTube era and the streaming era, we need to make sure that these broadcasts have rewatch value, because the highlight clips, that may get you the nuts and bolts of what happened, but that's not going to get a lot of views. And again, if I ever had the opportunity to really sit down with these guys and say, like, look, do this, I would bring that 2000 Phoenix race with me, because I watched that. I'm like, man, that is good. I don't know what we need to do to get there. Well, that is what we need.
Right.
Like, it was good.
Were
They just looked at, I mean, it was crazy.
Were there 2 races in Phoenix at that time, or just the one?
Just the one.
Okay.
See, that's the exciting too. Yeah, that was back in the time where you had to wait all the way till the next to last or the third to last. I think it used to be Phoenix, Homestead, Atlanta was the last 3. So it was, it wasn't the the championship race, of course, like it is now. But yeah, they still had just the one November date.
Gotcha. And to answer your point a little bit, the commentators were always very important to me. And watching the Richmond race a few weeks ago, something felt good about it, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then it dawned on me that Larry Mack is in the booth.
Yep.
And just what he brings to the broadcast with his insight, with his passion. I always felt that he was, he brought me up. He would get me more excited with certain things. I recently watched the end of the 2008 Daytona 500. And when they're coming off turn 4 and Larry's saying Ryan Newman he's got to make it wide, it brings you into it. And that was also a big part to me. And maybe you could speak on that a little bit in terms of the commentary.
Certainly. No, I sense that too. I think the one thing that was really important with that Richmond race, and again, it really encourages me, because it's telling me that Fox is actually kind of learning, from some past mistakes. I think they realized that last year in the spring race, they didn't cover it very well in the spring race. I think they were completely caught off guard by the tire strategy that Denny Hamlin worked out that allowed him to catch up and pass Byron and get the lead. Even the call that Mike Joy had at the end was flat, and I know he wasn't happy with that. Mm-hmm. Nothing seemed to be working right. So I think that they really knew they needed to have a crew chief presence or somebody that's strategy-minded in the booth, because they clearly didn't have it last year. And I think this race would have played out very differently. It would have played out just like that if they didn't have Larry Mack in the booth. I think that he changed that perception. I mean, we're talking, this is the crew chief that allowed Brett Bodine to win his first race at Wilkesboro in 1990 by short pitting. NASCAR Man History has an excellent video on that. Got to break down how exactly that played out. Because the Richmond race is the same way. But I think that was it. I think he kind of kept, not only does he have that excitement level, like you mentioned with the 2008 finish there, but awareness of the strategy and predicting what's going to be happening coming up. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big Steve Letarte fan on the NBC broadcast. I'm sure that was anticipated what his role would be. I think he doesn't, there's that X factor that he doesn't quite have that Larry McReynolds has, and I don't know exactly what that is. But maybe this positive example from that Richmond race would be something that leans that way. Because it was a much more enjoyable broadcast in that Richmond race this year. I think it was probably one of the best broadcasts they've had this year, honestly.
What I pick up from Larry Mack and what I picked up in the past from Darrell Waltrip and even Mike Joy today, and even Benny Parsons. Now, I'm familiar with Benny when he was on NBC with Alan Beswick and Wally, is that their love for the sport really comes through to my way of thinking.
And you can't fake that. That's the big thing.
Yeah. And that excites me and makes me want to be more invested in what they're saying because they're so excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's huge. I mean, it really is. I mean, I get very, very critical of the broadcasters, and I know that they're not 100% responsible for the way these races are shown, because again, the production crew deserves just as much scrutiny for how they film these shots and how they transition from one shot to the next. It's both parts got to be working together. But that doesn't mean that the broadcasters don't have any role, because when you hear bad commentary, you know it. I mean, how many times? I didn't personally have any problems with this, but I remember in 2005 they had like this one guy that was covering the Indy 500, and I guess he was like he wasn't covering motorsports that much, and the only person he talked about the entire broadcast was Danica Patrick. And yes,
Okay.
Danica Patrick was a huge story in that race because that was her breakout run, and she
Right.
ultimately almost won the race before Dan Weldon beat her. But that was like all he was talking about. Everybody's just like, don't do what that guy did.
Right.
But I just don't get why these other broadcasters today don't seem to get the same treatment. I'm again, I think you've had some problems on Fox's side where there's some talent that doesn't quite mesh. I mean, you mentioned the thing with Larry McReynolds and bringing him in there, and yeah, those are things that help. I've never been a big fan of like Adam Alexander on the Xfinity side. I think his heart's in the right place. I think he's got the knowledge. I just think he's a little too laid back. Just a little too laid back. Like, you can afford to be like kind of, like Bob Jenkins had a very, I think was self-deprecating to an extent, but he was very professional too. I think he suffered no fools in the booth. Ken Squire, same thing.
Yeah,
and that's kind of what I miss. I think you got to have a firm. If you're going to be the play-by-play guy, you got to have a firm hand on the wheel. And then the same thing with Rick Allen on the NBC side. I think the problem Rick Allen has is there's just too many people in the booth. 4 people is way too much, and especially when 3 of them sound the same. And then you got Rick just kind of getting talked over.
Right.
I think he needs to either assert himself more or just trim down what he has to compete with. The problem I have with Rick is I'm not sure if his passion for the sport is genuine, which is disappointing because I thought in the Trek series he had a very genuine passion for it. I thought he really knew who these guys were, and he had some great calls back then. I was stoked when he got the Cup, but it just hasn't transferred over. Now, in both cases with Adam and Rick, maybe it's a situation where it's how they're being directed. Maybe it's not a decision they themselves are making.
Right.
Mike Joy was very clear in saying that he is always performing for an audience of 1, and it's always like the guy at Fox that they got to basically says yay or nay to whatever decisions are going to be made over there. Maybe they're getting bad direction, so that could be it too. Because I was watching that Adam Alexander when Brendan Poole almost won that Talladega race, and I was like, wow, this is the same guy. That was a great call.
Yeah.
Just do that every week.
Right.
He actually looked like he was like the world's biggest Brendan Poole fan, and I was like, wow, good for him. But I don't know. But I think I think the problem is and I know that social media trends tends to be negative, and I try not to be too negative in my stuff. I get a bad rap on that sometimes there, but I think the alternative is to just go along with it and say, oh yeah, that's fine. That's damaging too. So I think any of the things that I bring up in particular are all fixable, and I do think there's a lot of raw potential there, but you got to do something with it because it's just it's not gonna go anywhere. We got all these people despairing about ratings and the fan base is too old and all that stuff. None of that would be a problem if you just stayed present. There needs to be more presence and purposefulness in there, and as long as that's there. That transcends age. That transcends how long you've been interested in the sport. That attracts new fans. That's what got me into it. I don't see why today is so different, but I don't know. I feel like I've gotten on too much of a rant on that.
No.
That's something that runs pretty deep for me.
That's okay. I can understand that. I mean, it was probably about 2 years before I went to my first race live, and I had been consuming only the broadcasts up until that first 2 years, and that was a big part of hooking me into the sport. Watching whether it was Darrell's interactions with the drivers or hearing Benny Parsons' passion and how they all work together. I think it's a funny example, but as played out as Boogity 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 may have been, I did have a Darrell Waltrip Boogity 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 shirt as I was coming up.
There you go. Yep.
So it was part of it, and some of those things that might have seemed silly or like an eye roll to us then, we seem to be missing it now. There's just something that we're just not hitting on these days.
Yeah. Well, the unfortunate reality, it's a brutal sport on all fronts. As entertaining as racing is, as spectacular as it is, it can be very unforgiving. And I think not just for drivers, but for media or broadcast in general.
It's a long season.
It is. It's a long season, and there's a lot of eyes watching you. And if there's any perceived, look how quickly, Jimmy Johnson's career went from, oh my gosh, he's one of the best ever, he's Mr. 7-time, to what have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
It was almost instant. Once he went to the Ally Bank sponsorship, it was like a light switch. Yeah. And it's like, what the heck? It's like, this guy is still the 7-time champion. He's still arguably, he dominated an entire decade of the sport. Yeah. He's still that guy. Okay, he's struggling a bit, but, come on, give the guy some latitude. Hasn't he earned it? But look, if Jimmy Johnson can't get that kind of latitude, what hope do, others? I mean, we've seen so much turnover with drivers that you maybe thought would never retire, or things like that. And I think that applies to broadcast, too. As I was there for Darrell Waltrip's last broadcast at Sears Point in 2019. Okay. It was, there was a tinge of sadness to it. I mean, I think they were trying to, really give him a proper send-off. But I mean, when a broadcaster gets older and everybody's watching, and maybe you flub a couple lines, or you get a stat wrong, or you just, or the sport just changes, and it's now so different that it's even hard to comment on. Yeah. I mean, maybe not. It's not like you just get completely, shuffled off and you don't pay attention to you, but maybe find a different role in that. Whether it would be nice to find a place for people. This came up when I talked with Jerry Nadeau, after doing the video there, is that was the big thing that happened with him. He gets injured in the sport, and he's just looking for something to do. He still cares about the sport. He knows he can't drive, but he knows that he has something that he still wants to offer, whether it's driver coaching or, consulting in some way. It just needs to be a place to put people. And I think that, applies with, again, either retired drivers or, excuse me, broadcasters or anything of that matter too. So I think that's very, it's easier said than done, but I think that would kind of lessen the sting a little bit of those transitions, I think.
Understood. So in closing, Brock, I'd like, and you could one race, 2 races, whatever you'd like to do, but I'd like to ask you about some standout races, whether you've seen them in person or whether it was a broadcast that you watched. I think that every fan has them. I certainly do. What might be 1 or 2 of some races that either you think about from time to time, or one that you enjoy going back to watch again? What might a few of those be?
Daytona 500. That one, I mentioned this in my broadcast criticisms video last year, and it's still one of my all-time, in terms of fantastic camera, in terms of a production. If you're thinking about a race as a movie production, and this was even more the case for me because in 2005, they actually they live streamed the Daytona 500 in a couple movie theaters in the U.S. and they sold tickets to it. And the only 2 places they showed it, I think it was 3 places. I think it was in New York, it was in Chicago, and then it was at the Irvine Spectrum, which is in Orange County, and that just happened to be like 10 minutes from where I was going to college. It was just down there. And you couldn't buy tickets for it. Initially, you had to win them in a drawing, and basically anybody that entered, and it was like through the local Fox affiliate. So we entered that, and basically, I don't know if they had enough interest in it, so basically anybody that entered it got tickets. So my brother and I were there for that, and so we got the experience of watching that race in a movie theater, as if it was a movie, and it fit it perfectly, because there's this shot, I mean, the last few laps of that race, where you got Tony Stewart's dominating most of that race. Then suddenly Dale Jr. hasn't been a factor the entire day. And you got some murmuring in the crowd there with us there too. And they're kind of getting into it also. Mm-hmm. They see him start to kind of work up there. And there's this moment where they're side by side and he's trying to get in front of Stewart. And then he does. And Darrell Waltrip's like, he made it. And then you hear the crowd's right. Going nuts over the speakers. And there's this wonderful shot of the backstretch grandstands. And it pulls back. And you see the cars coming down, the hole in the middle of the backstretch, and Junior leading the way. and then him moving up the track and hitting the triangle. It's just beautiful. It's everything. It's first and foremost, it's super speedway racing is the way it's supposed to sound with those cross pipe headers and all that.
Right.
The cars sound amazing. They look amazing. You got all the big names. Even though I'm not a big name guy, I mean, you had Tony Stewart, Dale Jr., Jeff Gordon, Jimmy Johnson, Kurt Busch, all those guys up there, and right behind them you had Rusty Wallace and Mark Martin, who were just announcing their retirement season that year. Of course, for Mark, the plans changed, but at the time we thought this was going to be their last Daytona 500. They're working their way up, and in between them are Scott Riggs, who's come out of nowhere to have like this tremendous speed weeks there and trying to just close it out. And Kevin LePage, who had no sponsorship on a Dodge John Carter fielded until Patron Tequila came on board. Mm-hmm. And he's about to get the first top 10 since he drove for Roush. And this whole mix, and they don't wreck. They all keep it together. Yes. And they got this huge finish. And Jeff, I'm not a big Jeff Gordon fan, but Gordon wins the 500, but any one of those guys could have won it. Yeah. That's one. I may not watch it, start to finish. Although I think the whole race is fine. I know it gets some criticism for a lot of debris cautions, but those last few laps are just magical. Just magical. I don't think that race gets near enough credit for being. It's perfect. And you talk about Larry McReynolds. I mean, he was very much a big part of that too. It was Mike Joy, Larry McReynolds, Darren Waltrip, all three of them absolutely firing on all cylinders. Production hitting it out of the park. It shows that they can do it. They can do it. I mean, you can take it. Talladega's coming up this weekend. If they just kind of looked at that for inspiration, even if the race doesn't turn out to be nearly as competitive with 38 cars versus 43 or whatever, it would. I think it would help a lot. But that one stands out. That one stands out for sure. There's other ones for sure, but for brevity, I'll just mention that one.
Okay, I gotcha. If I could tell you a short story, one particular race that stands out for me, which wasn't even it wasn't even the race, it was what surrounded it. And a lot of my memorable races are certain things that surround it. 2006, Aaron's 499, Jimmy Johnson had gone on to win it. And if you recall, that race was rained out until Monday. And I was probably at that point at the peak of my NASCAR fandom. I was 16 years old, and I was all about it. And Talladega was one of my favorite tracks. It gets rained out. I have school the next day, and Brock, I was heartbroken. I wasn't going to be able to see the race. It was rained out. And at the time, my mother had taken my interest in NASCAR not super seriously. Everybody kind of thought, okay, Albert's going through this phase where he's into NASCAR. And the following day I'm at school, and all I could think about is that Talladega's happening and I'm missing it. And I get called down to the office. And what did I do to get called down to the office? And when I'm there, my mother is there and says, oh, I'm here to take you out for your appointment with Dr. Waltrip. And that was it was so cool, sitting and eating my school lunch at home, watching that race. And there are times where I'll rewatch that race just for that memory.
Oh, I love it. I love that.
So thank
you for sharing that. That's awesome.
Yes, that's always every spring Talladega race. I'm always reminded of that and always make special arrangements to try not to miss it, just for that reason. So
yeah, got to schedule that appointment with Dr. Waltrip. I like that.
Yeah,
that's awesome. No, see, that's so good. It becomes. You mentioned this earlier about that being like part of a family. Almost it becomes a family experience in that sense too. You could have. You're watching a race and maybe in a whole other state, whole other part of the country, but you have this connection to something in your own life, and it becomes a life experience too. So no, that's tremendous. I love that.
Yes, so many. So I grew up in New York City. Not a lot of NASCAR going on, but one of the local radio stations started to do a contest, and it was New Hampshire 2006. They wanted to know, okay, call-in show on Monday, who won the race yesterday? And we end up winning the contest and get a bunch of different things. So that's another race that really, in and of itself is nothing big about it. Harvick won. There was, the amount of action that an average New Hampshire race would have. But like you say, it enters our lives. And
it does.
That's what made me really grow and really love the sport to this day.
There you go.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I love that. No, see, that's what the sport really needs. I don't know how the sport needs to embrace that, but they should, because I think that there's a you got people that are dedicated football fans or baseball fans or something like that, and they'll talk about where they were when the Red Sox won the World Series or something like that, and NASCAR is very much like that, and it could be. And there's so much more aspects to it, because you have all these different drivers and all these different teams and sponsors and moments that can happen in a race from one to the other and the history. It can become very personal.
Yeah. So with all that, Brock, I really, really appreciate you giving me your time tonight. It was great to converse with you. Before we go, would you mind filling people in on where they could find you and where they could find your work?
Absolutely. The best place is check out my website, LASTCAR.info. Follow the last place finishers, the Cup, Xfinity, and Truck Series races, as well as our staff writers, William Saki and Ben Schneider, cover other series, including IndyCar. That is, again, at LASTCAR.info. Look up Brock Beard on YouTube. You'll find my content on there, as well as my, excuse me, bad timing with coughs here. Allergy season in full effect here at Last Friday. The Brock Beard on YouTube. You look up my channel on there. I do weekly live streams, usually about 15 minutes after the race is over with. Talk about the action there from the track and do some trivia along the way. Patreon.com/LASTCARonBrock if you're interested in supporting the site. Helps pay for our staff writers, as well as doing trackside coverage, license issues there for the videos I produce on the channel and so forth. Really helps out on that. And at LASTCARonBrock on Twitter for any of my other updates there through the week, including live tweets during the races themselves.
Cool. And if I'm correct, your J.D. McDuffie book is available on Amazon?
It is, yes. Thank you. The J.D., the title is just J.D. That's available on Amazon right now. The second edition's available for print. And if you're interested in getting your copy signed, stay tuned, because we'll probably be doing some we would definitely be doing some book signings for the Derrike Cope book. And of course, I'm not going to turn down any JD books that show up there as well. So we'll be doing that at the same time. So stay tuned for more on that. Again, the Twitter feed at LASTCARonBrock would be the best place to get more updates on that.
Cool. Well, thank you once again, Brock, for giving your time for the podcast. And also, thank you for all the time and effort you put into putting out your material for this sport. I know I speak for a lot of people and say that I really enjoy what you're doing and look forward to what you have coming up.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot. I really aim to bring as many people into the sports history as possible, and if it's something else that people will find enjoyment in, that does make my day. So I appreciate you letting me know.
Absolutely. I'm like I said, I'm looking forward to what you have coming up, and I'll most likely be seeing you after Talladega for your behind the wall.
There you go. Oh, yeah, enjoy the sprint races. There you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Brock Beard on the Planet Shivers Podcast. What fun. That was a very enjoyable episode for me. It was great to speak with Brock about sport we both love. And there's going to be more racing-related podcasts coming up. Nick, if you remember from a few episodes ago, Nick Barbatti, otherwise known as Alfonso Adams, he and I recorded a NASCAR episode that will be coming out very soon. I'm going to just keep on keeping on with this thing. It's been a lot of fun. We are so close to episode 100, and there's big doings for episode 100, and I can't wait for you guys to hear and see it. Till next time, you could find this episode and more on all major podcast platforms and YouTube with video. I want to give one more big thank you to Brock Beard for coming on the show and spending time with us. There's going to be a lot of cool episodes coming up, and I hope you guys stick around for them. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of somebody else.
In America, there exists a sport that is driven by the fans. They are why everyone works so hard, on the teams and at the tracks, in front of the grandstands and behind the scenes, to give the fans the greatest race possible. NASCAR fans deserve the best, starting from the high banks of Daytona, all the way to the shores of California, and at every race in between. NASCAR fans, you're the reason for our success. Thanks.